Robert George O'Mealy, born in Washington, D.C., December 31st, 1948, which makes me 73 years and counting.
Very good, thank you. I was wondering if we could begin by describing your childhood in D.C. And what life was like.
Well, I was born in Freedman's Hospital, which is now Howard University Hospital. And when I taught at Howard, I was very aware, and I used to tell my students that I was born right on the campus, which is literally true. When I was born, my family lived at G Street at 13th Northeast. And so while I have only the dimmest memory of any of that, looking back, it means something to me that we lived on Capitol Hill, so near to the seats of power and places where the great museums and so on are to be found. When I was 4, I guess, we moved to the Petworth area near Roosevelt High School. And so I moved from one all-black community to another. And in that Petworth community, we lived at 718 Taylor Street. It was one of those storybook situations where my family and I knew everybody on that street, which meant that if I remember just being upset with my parents and getting to the corner and I realized I wasn't supposed to turn that corner and freezing there because the neighbors would all see me, and if I took 2 steps in the wrong direction, so I just had to head on back home. But that neighborhood I visited recently and looked at the alley behind our street where we used to play a much harder game than baseball because you were out if you hit the ball outside the slender lane of the alleyway. You were supposed to learn to hit the ball straight down the alley. And that was very good practice for somebody who was interested in baseball. And I was very close to the kids on the street, and one boy in particular named Brian Johnson, who went to Howard and became a photographer, photography teacher, or art teacher now, professional photographer in Chicago. And he was a wonderful friend to have. He was 2 years older, so it was great to have an intelligent older friend. Intelligent meaning that he knew how to catch an ant and put it in a spider web, and other such tricks. That he knew how to shoot marbles and flip baseball cards and things like that. So we had a club that we just called the Club of all the kids on the street. There were about 10 of us that were very, very close, and our parents all shared sugar and recipes and babysitting duties. And so as far as race was concerned, it was far away from me at that point. I know now that my parents just never spoke of it. There was once when the pattern was broken and I said, "Can we go to Glen Echo?" And then my mother had to say...
Glen Echo being an amusement park,
That was
right?
an amusement park.
Yes, and it's in a more white...
It was closed to black people, except, if I'm remembering correctly, on certain days. And so we didn't go. My mother didn't want us to witness the segregated scene in that particular way. But she told us about it, my sister and I were told. But it didn't seem to matter that much anyway. We went to Lucretia Mott Elementary School, where my mother was a teacher. And that was an all-black school. And I remember hearing in the barbershop as a kid that there were 2 school systems in Washington, the white one and the black one. was so far superior to the white one that all this talk about integration was probably not a good idea. Because then we'd have these lazy teachers who might not care about our children. And what would happen to the black principals and teachers in that kind of a situation? And so I was aware, sort of out of the periphery of my vision, that there was something going on, but straight ahead, the teachers cared about us very deeply. I was unable to get away with anything because the teacher would say, and I knew them as, Aunt so-and-so, and they were friends of my mother's. But in school, I was Robert, and Mrs. Premdas would call me over as if she never saw me in her life. And she'd say, I know you're not out of place here. I'm going to turn my head and I'll find out that you're not in the hallway with you. So I had a kind of special status in what looked like a special school. And that's where I first met Chico, or Ernie Wilson. He was in that school too. I didn't really know him, but I was aware of this other kid there. And so it was a black world, and it was complete in itself, and it was very nurturing. I had beloved friends. My mother was a school teacher. So I was in first grade. The kids would come to me and say, "You miss oatmeal, son?" And I was so tired of that joke. Well, it amuses me now. I said, "Yeah, this is O'Mealy's son," and then they would walk away laughing. But the point was that I felt very welcome and on teasing terms with everybody around.
So it was a very, like you said, nurturing, very wonderful environment to grow up in.
It was. Part of what made it wonderful was that my father was who he was. George O'Mealy was a great man, and I'm proud to be named for him, Robert George O'Mealy. I ran into Brian about 5 years ago. I looked him up, and we managed to meet in Queens. And he said, "What am I supposed to call you, doctor?"
I'm sorry, Brian. You're
Brian Johnson, my childhood friend.
Your childhood friend, yes.
And here he was now, a grandparent looking at retirement, and we just looked at one another and laughed. And I said, I always wanted to ask you why you put up with me as such a little kid. I was 4, and you were 6, going on 7. And I expected him to say, "Well, Bobby, don't you know you were a genius, and you were as good a sports player as I was." But he didn't say anything like that. He said, "I remember when you guys moved into the neighborhood, and my family brought me over and to meet you." And he said, "Try to picture my father." And I said, "Your father? I never met him." He said, "Neither did I." "Try to picture my mother." I said, "Well, my mother, your mother was sickly, and I remember that she would come by sometimes in an ambulance or a cab just to visit." I said, "Yeah, I hardly knew her either. I adored her." But we went by your house, and then the door opened, and there were these 2 adults and 2 children, and a mother and a father. And your father stepped out on the porch and said, "How's it going there, boy?" And he said, the resonance of that voice, as he touched my hand, I could feel it through the floorboards of the building. And he said, "Come on around here anytime you feel like it." And he said, "I was in love with the idea of family that your family represented, and your father's power and welcome. That's why I came around. It was fun to play with you, but it was really your dad. He was a map maker. I didn't know any other cartographers, black or white, but he would take me. He worked for the Department of Interior. I'd go down and see all these special machines and maps. And so that was part of what made my father seem like a genius to me when I was a child. He could draw an uncannily straight line, which, to make a long story short, is how he got kicked out in the Army as the one for special training to learn enough about engineering and maps to keep his company, his Army company, all black together. The fact that he was Jamaican is a very big thing. It meant that for him the whole racial code was a piece of ridiculous fiction. He came to the United States as an 11-year-old. He had run away from home to catch up with his family that preceded him here, and joined them in New York and then Chicago. And so I couldn't know what the conversations were in other households, but he conducted a sense of household that named him as a Jamaican, and he talked about how he had to fill out a card when he joined the Army and write the word or check beside the box that said Negroes. He was my color, and he certainly was. He looked like what we call African American, but for him he was a British citizen, Jamaican, and now he was American, and the idea that he was supposed to be inferior to anybody was preposterous. And I was so bathed in the sunlight of that assurance and nurtured by that sense of power that Brian felt in his grip. Because of him, we would go to places that were segregated. And in Washington,
could you describe where those places would be?
well, there was a store, the Petworth Drugstore on Georgia Avenue at, I think it's Taylor, but I'm not sure. It's that alphabet anyway. And that was one of the drugstores that you could go in and buy things, but you couldn't sit at the counter. And maybe there were other restrictions that I didn't know about too. But my father would go in and out, and I know now that because it was Washington and you could never be sure that this dark-skinned person was not Indian or the ambassador from
Somewhere
Africa.
in Africa, yes.
So if the person had a certain sort of presentation, they didn't question you. And my father certainly had that, and so he would go in. And one time my sister Sharon and I were told to just go in and order whatever kind of ice cream we wanted at the counter. We sat at the counter and ordered it, and the guy said, we don't serve you here. And so I ran back to the car and said, Dad, I didn't have a service. And I remember in the old-fashioned cars, you hear the brake.
Yeah.
Daddy went in there and went behind the counter and talked to the guy. And I wish I'd had the kind of microphone they have here to hear what he said to them. But it was something to the effect that you see those shoes, you give them anything they tell you that they want and do it right now. And then don't let there be any question about it ever again if they come in here. And he came over and served us very nervously. And so that sense that even if we did face the color line, which of course eventually more and more we did, we had backup. And in the form of this community that included the school, that included the church, it included family beyond the people that I've named. And so yes, we had a tremendous sense of community, but I want to stress the uniqueness of, and I realized that it was a class advantage that had to do with my mother being a teacher and my father being a foreigner, and part of what that meant was that there were people in town who, I never heard this happen, but my mother told them that there were those monkey chaser, the black people who were prejudiced against Caribbean people. But it's hard to imagine all that. But in the end, you did have a nurturing sense of community.
So we know that one side of the family was from Jamaica. How about your mother's side?
Well, my mother you're sitting here with these lights and all, it just reminds me, my mother died in 2005, and she lived a great life. She was nearly 90 when she died and so on. So. But right to the end, her way of teasing me was to say, give me back that nose. My nose is so like hers. She get that mouth, give me back that mouth. She was born in Washington too, as her parents were. And so she's one of the old, it always knocks me out when people brag about being first families of Washington and all of that. What that meant in our family was that my grandparents, one set of them, certainly were slaves in Washington. So are we going to brag about that? I don't think so. Her grandfather, Carter, I can't think of his first name right now, I think it was Robert Carter even then, was owned by the city of Washington, and he drove the police wagon. And the family story is that what that meant is that he was traveling around the city all the time, and slave that he was the one you could go to and say, so man, southeast man, is there a fire over there? What about that girl who was hurt over there? He was moving all the time, so he would bring the news, and he was within a strictly restricted, minute little avenue. He was cosmopolitan, moving around. His wife was I know she was a laundress, but she probably was a woman of all work for the people that that were so-called owned her. And I have a table that my aunt specifically left in her will to me. She said, he'll appreciate this. And my great-grandmother, I'm sure, polished that table a million times before when she was free and she was given the table. And so I have that sense of a background there that has its margins of victory and agency, but it's foolish to forget the real economics and politics of those situations too. But in any case, my grandmother, how she did it, I don't know. Her mother died when she was 13, and my grandmother tells a story that her mother, who had been a slave, called her in and said, look, I'm not going to live long, and don't you dare cry. She always puts that part in the story. Don't you dare cry. I'm talking to you. You will raise your little sister. She was 13. And you will be the lady of this house. And don't let anybody in this place take over you. And so my grandmother at 13 made sure that her baby sister made it through high school. And she herself finished high school and then went to minor teachers college, where she met my grandfather. My grandfather.
Minor Teachers College was?
Minor Teachers College is down the street from Howard. It's now called DC Teachers College and became part of UDC. Is that right? It's UDC.
Exactly where my mom and my grandparents met there too.
Is that so? Yeah. Well, I have a picture of them in a class. There must have been 15 people in the class. And you think, these are the sons and daughters of slaves. Collars starched to the nines. My grandmother looked like a movie star. My grandfather is there looking like he might be a diplomat from someplace great. And they bought a house at 13th and G. And she became a teacher, and he was a counselor at one of the schools, and I'm not sure which one, but his job was to supervise the unruly young boys. And the story is that Robert Brown was called Jack because he could run like a jackrabbit. But it was also known that he would be brought in, and the teacher said, this kid needs to be taken out of here. And his reputation was that he would go and take the kid, take him by the wrist, and snatch up to the floor and say, "We're sorry to disturb the class. He won't be back today, but tomorrow he will be back." And just quiet, but tremendously strong, Mr. Robert Brown. He went to Howard to get his master's degree in education. And so there was that strong sense of background. So both my mother and her sister also went to minor teachers college, and also eventually went to Howard, and taught full careers in that school system. And by the way, my Aunt Evelyn, I'm very proud of, because she said that the teachers finishing my minor were told, "We need teachers in Washington, but we also need teachers at the other black communities of this nation. And we need you to look at the map and think about Mississippi and South Carolina and Alabama." And I'm not sure where she went, but my aunt spent her first couple of years of teaching in one of these so-called country schools. And she was proud of that service, and it's something amazing. Just on the amazing side of things, the story of my grandmother, one story that I love is that at 19th Street Baptist Church, which is still here now on 16th Street, which amuses me a lot, but we went to 19th Street.
Why does it amuse you?
Well, it was called 19th Street Baptist Church,
Oh, I
because that's
see.
where
Now
it was.
it's-
And now it's on 16th.
Okay, I see,
But it's
okay.
still called 19th.
I see, okay.
And not just 19th Baptist, but 19th Street, and there it is. But one Sunday, Reverend Jerry Moore, 19th Street Baptist Church, said, "We've got several children without homes, and
It's okay, take it.
it's the coffee." But for her to raise her hand and to take the woman I knew as Aunt Beatty and raise her too. So,
Amazing.
so there was a sense of community responsibility. There was.
Despite all the pressures and what was going on in terms of the, if I may call it, the outside world, right? Because this is a segregated time. And yet you have such a powerful community that just takes care of
So-
whatever comes along.
So on Taylor Street, my mother she made it understood that don't throw that toy away. If you've got clothes you don't need. So, the whole notion of class was significant, but it also dissolved, because she brought those gifts as she would to us, just because it was a sense of responsibility. I have a picture of her, my mother at Mott, lining up the kids to get cod liver oil. She's there with a spoon as if she said, "Don't turn your head, or you're going to get it." And so that was, it just went with the territory. That if you are responsible, just as my grandmother would be on the bus and she'd see somebody else, I'd see people on the bus now, and I'd say, "Good thing Gramps is gone." And she would say, "You sit still, young man. You heard what your mother said. You sit in your seat." She would call you out because she felt that as an adult who had been through what she had been through, she had to take her place as a person of responsibility. And so on my mother's side of the family, there was a very strong sense of all that, although what went with it is I remember asking my grandmother to tell me one thing about what it was like to be raised by two people who were slaves, or were enslaved. Tell me one thing about your childhood. And she would pause and she'd say, you're not old enough to hear this. I was 15 and then I was 17 and I was still not old enough, and I asked my mother, I said, when is Gramps going to tell me something about this? And she said, Bobby, I'm 45 and she tells me I'm not old enough either. She's not going to speak of this. She wants us to move forward as a people, and she doesn't want to discourage you with too much information.
What you described is such a, I want to say, it's such a dignified and powerfully pride is not the right word. I mean, when you describe the photograph where everything's starched and gorgeous and just so beautiful, right? I mean, the level of refinement, this is what, refinement, in all aspects of this civilization, if I may call it that, right? That you take children that are orphaned and there's no question asked, you just, okay, we have to take this one in, Or so many other aspects of this community, but there's this incredible sense of support and dignity and refinement.
Well, at Mott School, what year would it have been? Like 1955, when I was in kindergarten. You couldn't walk in the building right away. You could play, and then you'd hear something. I guess a bell would ring, and then you had to line up. And your teacher would make sure your fingernails were clean, make sure your shoes were shined, your face was washed, and after fingernail inspection and other things like that, we would be allowed to come in. Or the boys had to show that you had a handkerchief in your back pocket that was clean, and a white handkerchief would have to be shown. And if you didn't have it, you would be warned. And the next time, you might be sent back home. And then if you did it again, God help you, there was a man named Mr. Broadus, I will never forget, who would take a boy who came in there with his dirty fingernails and show him what it meant to be washed by Mr. Broadus. He'd take a brown soap and scrub you till you screamed. But there was a strong sense of dignity. At Mott School, I only attended there through the 3rd grade and then moved to another school. But I can remember even then, Mrs. H.B. Williams telling us, we have a long way to go as a people. When I tell you to sit still and pay attention, I need you to do that, because we are going to need you to be the leaders of tomorrow. And so now let's go back to the lesson, and we're going to sit still now. And that sense of being part of a long freedom struggle went with the territory of being in that school. And when I taught when I finished Harvard, with my PhD.
Let's talk about that. So no. Okay, tell the story, and then we got to find out. Okay.
Well, I finished my dissertation, my PhD, and
at Harvard.
At Harvard.
In what department?
In the English department.
Okay.
1975. And I told my advisor, Daniel Aaron, that the only place I wanted to teach was Howard. And he said, that can't be right, Howard. What about University of Virginia has an opening? There's an opening. Harvard was used to placing people at Williams and at their counterparts. Howard, and I said, you don't realize what Howard means to our community, and I don't want to teach anywhere but there. And when I went there to teach, my senior professor, and by the way, this is something too, that Sterling Brown had retired, but that made not a shred of difference. When I called him, he was my senior professor. And I wanted him to read my dissertation. He read it with great care. And had the best advice I'd had, because he knew Ralph Ellison. He knew the situation from the outside. So that sense of responsibility was something that I carried with me to Howard. And I wasn't going to scold the youngsters, but we all knew that we were in the midst of the Black Arts Movement at that point, the incipient Black Arts Movement, or the ongoing in 1975. And that we had work to do. This could not be a party school, as much fun as it was to be at Howard. I could see that. Yeah, that's why I jumped ahead, just to say that what I saw at Mott School, which was right down the hill, 4th and W, right down the hill from Howard, I saw follow through at Howard, and it's true now.
Yes.
You can go there, and people are there. They could be elsewhere, but that's where they choose to be, students and professors and administrators, because of this sense of responsibility, and because of the kind of majesty of the history there.
And which, as you describe, I mean, you mentioned how if there were teachers that had just graduated from the college, they would tell them there are places in the country that need your help, that need your skills. And so think about where you might be able to go and help out. So it's not just a local network, it's a nationwide, if you will.
Without question. So many of the youngsters they weren't youngsters, they weren't babies anymore, finishing graduate school. Yes, they went to Brown, and yes, they went to Yale and other places like that, but others decided on Tuskegee, and others decided on Morehouse. How can you do better than teaching at Morehouse or Howard? And what can be seen as a cliche of going back and serving the community that served you well was very much alive for me as a young man, and remains so.
So you did public schools in Washington, segregated schools, right?
Not only.
Okay.
I still don't know how it happened, really. But my parents bought a house at 8th and Quackenboss Northwest, which had been zoned as an all-white community. And there we were, the second black family on the street. And by the way, the other family was Nation of Islam. And they had a flag, an Islamic flag, almost as big as a house, across the front porch that say, "We don't care what you think." And they were country people who parked the car right in the front yard. And I thought, okay, you got it. And we were from another kind of sense of things. And we were trying to show how worthy we were, I guess. Although we did have this history to prove so. But it was important to me to find myself then in a neighborhood where you couldn't find a third black family, no matter what direction you walked in. When we first got there, whatever that would have been, 57 or so. And lo and behold, there's Ernie Wilson. His family had moved there too. Pushing a baby carriage with Malik's Aunt Wendy, who's now grandmother. So it was nice to meet them. And with my father, I took my sister and me to Brightwood Elementary School, where each of us took our places as the first black kids in the classes we were in.
How was that like?
I can laugh now, just barely. I remember my father pulling up in the car, and before he let us out, he said, "Now, no matter what you see, or no matter what anybody else says, you are as good as anybody, anywhere. Have a good day." And I thought, why would he have to tell us that if we were? And anyway, so then I was in the 4th grade, Miss Dawson's class, and all the kids were staring at me, that they've got a black kid in the class, and many of them had been to Brightwood since kindergarten, and there was this change, and way of looking at it was, honestly, it's whether it's healthy or not, my way of dealing with it was to say, I don't care what you do. I will outrun you. I will play football better than you. I will kick your tail. I will beat you at the spelling bee. We'll do math until you cry. It was probably, a kind of compensatory point of view, but I was going to represent in this extraordinary sense that may or may not have made any sense. But I was very aware of David Oken, and he got 8 or 9 A's, and I had to get at least that in order to take my place in the class. The good news there is that, first the bad news is that, or mixed news. I had friends in the class. I can name 5 or 6 or more of them now. Johnny Nathanson and Stanley Berg and Elizabeth Lindsay.
All black?
No, these are all white kids
These
now.
are all white kids.
And what I learned, it didn't take long to learn this, was that we could be friends at school, but I'd see them on the street and they would act like they didn't see me, with their families or with their white friends. And I would invite them to the house and they wouldn't come, and then they would never, and it wasn't until years later that I realized that there were all these birthday parties taking place, and I never attended a birthday party except with my black friends from school and church and the old neighborhood. And so that was that strange dissonance between being very friendly at school, or whatever, just normal kids, not friendly, but whatever it was, boxing and playing and competing and whatever. And then the school bell rings and they don't know you. And I remember once a kid named Joe Hardy invited me to his house. I thought, this is good. And we were down in the basement doing something or other on Blair Road we were. And he heard his father come in the house. And he said, oh, my father's home. I said, no, what's that? And he and I climbed out the basement window so that his father wouldn't beat Joe for having this kid in his house as a black.
So how many black kids were at this new school?
My guess, as I say, I was the only one in my class of maybe 25. And Sharon was the only one in her class, the same number. But the segregation turned very quickly, or the integrate, whatever it was. And so there were for sale signs all over the white neighborhood. Our next door neighbors, the Leons, came by and said, we really like you, but the property value is a concern for us, and so we're moving to Silver Spring, and good luck, we can't live here with you. And by 5th grade, there were 2 more black boys and 1 black girl. I can still picture them as children. And we were a kind of cabal in our little group. And, but there were, what I think of now as breaks in the pattern of segregation. So Michael McTighe was my buddy, and I went to Michael's house, and somehow he and his mother had a small apartment near the school, and somehow they were exempt from the other stuff. And Elizabeth Lindsay, and we sat together because we were seated alphabetically, so Lindsay, McTighe, Nathanson, O'Mealy, all right in there. And I became friends with all of them, Nathanson too. And I could visit them at home, and that was remarkable to see that. The kind of inside of a white person's house. And so those, what Ellison calls them breaks in the pattern, meant a great deal to me. I saw, first of all, that I knew white kids that were
And by Ellison, you mean Ralph Ellison?
Ralph Ellison.
Ralph
Ralph Ellison, he grew up in a fiercely segregated Oklahoma City,
Yes.
but there were these breaks in the pattern, where his father had a white friend and so on.
I'm going to stop here for 1 second. All I just need you to do is just clap your hands 1 time for me. Okay, continue.
Oh, that's funny.
this is now, you're getting to hang out more with the white students, going to their homes, they come to your home, right?
Yes.
And so what grades are we talking about now?
We're now 5th, 6th
Okay,
at Brightwood.
then you go to middle school,
Then we went to junior high school,
junior high school.
Paul Junior High, at Peabody and 8th Street. Street's a block from where I lived. And by then, the school that had been 100% white was now 80% white, as the kids who could afford to do so got out. But the ones who remained, many of them remained by choice. And
The ones who remained where?
in other words, the white kids whose parents did not feel they had to be rescued from the
I
integrated
see.
scene,
Okay,
but who instead decided to remain in the school in the neighborhood,
right.
were many of them quite wonderful people, and in a couple of cases, lifelong friends of mine. And as I look back at that motley crew of white, exceptional people, my best friend was in that category, and I don't put him in any category. Stephen Good was the was the son of an American diplomat. When I first got to 7th grade at Paul Junior High School, there was Stephen Good, and in that class, and it's hard to tell where friendships begin, but he and I were friends right away. French, English, or no French or English. He liked football, and he liked sports in general. He invited me to his house without thinking twice about it. And he had a pool table at home and a ping pong table. I had the same, and we had a lot in common. We loved to laugh, and so there he was as a very good friend. But it was very significant too that his parents were relatively high-level diplomats. His next job, when he left Washington, Dr. Good's job was ambassador to Zambia. So he was in that kind of diplomatic circle already. And what that meant was that he and Nancy Good, his wife, were community activists. And so when they found out that 7th grade and no language course, Stephen is going to lose his French, they organized a group of parents who developed a fund to bring in a teacher to continue just elementary French lessons, so Steve could keep it and the rest of us would learn. And as I look back now, I think they made a special point of making that teacher someone, I don't know now whether it was Senegal or from Niger, but it was an African French speaker. So now, I'd had black teachers all my life, so it wasn't a shock, but now I got this African French speaker teaching the white kids French. So this isn't lost on me. It's very exciting, and exciting to know people like that. And Mrs. Good said, here we are in Washington. Have the kids been down to the Senate, and have they been to the National Archives? Have they seen it? Of course, the teachers are beleaguered and they only have so much money, but Mrs. Good organized something called the Democracy in Action program. And if you signed up, she and another parent would take the kids who wanted to go. My first trip to the Smithsonian and to these other National Portrait Gallery and National Gallery of Art, Mrs. Good made sure of it. She invited Jack Kennedy to speak at our school, and when he couldn't come, I remember it looks like Jack can't do it, so we're going to get Edward. And so there's Senator Kennedy speaking to our 7th or 8th grade class. She said there's no school newspaper. She started one. There's a newspaper called The Intersection. It's interesting that that's what it was called. because the classes were called sections, and she said this will be the intersection. And I'm sure she had the idea of our headline, or the motto of the newspaper was, "All the news that fits, we print." That's kind of take off on the New York Times thing. And but she said the kids who should be writing for publication, and so there we were. And so here was something like what I'd seen all my life. One of the parents taking special responsibility, and now they were friends of my parents, Dr. and Mrs. Good. And I'd come downstairs and they'd be laughing in the living room, and they were pals. And they gave a party once a year called Eggnog for Eggheads. And it was the first time I'd been to a social event at a white person's home. And I couldn't believe it. Upstairs, the adults were arguing about Vietnam and what to do about Angela Davis and this and that. Angela Davis a bit later. And downstairs, the kids were partying like we partied at the black parties. I had no idea why people were dancing, and some of them were not dancing. I have to say that.
Yes.
But anyway, it was a wonder and a tremendous gift to all concerned that there were such associations. They organized other parents, and I say they now, my parents, Steve's parents, Chico's parents, Ernie Wilson's parents, Henry Kennedy and other, Gordon Berg's parents, and they formed something called Neighbors Incorporated. And Neighbors Incorporated was a willfully integrated group of adults living in that neighborhood of upper Northwest Washington. And what they decided was, let's not run. Let's make this work. This is this is democracy in action. This is the experiment that the country is based on. Let's make it work. And so they would meet at my house and meet it all around the neighborhood at different people's houses. And then eventually, I don't know how it happened, but they or someone formed a group called Junior Neighbors. And so now the sons and daughters of this kind of revolutionary cabal would meet. And we would talk about, or more than anything else, it would come down to, so, are we going to party at your house, or are we going to party at we like to think we were political, and I guess we were, but it was political enough to organize these first interracial parties that I ever witnessed with just the kids now. And there was a family named Mary Ellinger and her family, Donald, her father and mother, the Ellingers. And that was another place where upstairs the adults would be playing chess and talking politics. Mr. Ellinger was the lobbyist for the Machinists Union. And so he was a lefty and an activist, and he'd be pounding the table about one thing or the other. And all of these adults would be doing their thing. And then the basement, by now, as junior or senior year at Coolidge High School, we were really partying. It was really just it was still almost unheard of for there to be a white-black couple. That was so rare. But the ones that I knew about came out of that kind of setting where it was taken for granted.
And this was
1965, 66. And by then, by the way, Ernie, I call Chico, and I were best friends. And his parents were important to the group. And I'd like to say a word about his parents, because they were, you live in a neighborhood, and there are were all kinds of, many of the blacks who were there had just come off the bus from Alabama, and in some cases they were doctors and lawyers and very sophisticated people, and in other cases they were country people now in the city. But there was nobody in my group of white friends, such as they were, like Steve or like the Ellingers. They see that these were very exceptional people. And Chico's parents were totally off the hook. I'd never met anybody like them. His father
This was a black family.
This was a black family.
In D.C.
In
yes.
D.C.
Okay.
And they lived near Howard, where I later learned that Chico's father, Ernie Wilson, had worked as he was the dean, one of the deans there. And then they moved up to the same neighborhood. They were in Rittenhouse and that 3-syllable alphabet that Quackenboss was part of. That's where I lived. And so I would walk around the Rittenhouse and see Chico. And his father was the dean of foreign students at Howard. And so what that meant was that you go over there and Mr. Wilson said, "Oh man, I'm glad you're here. We have some youngsters who just, you're going to spend a few days with us. They're here from Barbados, and we'll make them feel welcome. And there's some other kids here from Morocco." And Howard had more foreign students than any school in the country in terms of percentage. It was so-called all black. I mean, it was all, but they were from everywhere. And so in Chico's house, we met people speaking Italian. Blacks people did what? We met people from India and Pakistan who were black in that special sense, you know. And to witness for myself this kind of international community sharing, and also the sense of responsibility that now extended to them, people who just got off the plane from some place you never heard of. I remember we met, there was one kid who was Mamadou, and his last name was Doudou. And I said, "I'm supposed to call this brother Doudou?" I don't know about that now, because I'm used to that. But you had to get your mouth ready for other people's way of doing and talking. And
Very cosmopolitan.
it was
Amazing.
extremely cosmopolitan. And Mrs. Wilson was a housewife, but what that meant was that she belonged to every organization I've named. She was a PTA leader and a community builder, and she was a voracious reader. So you go to the Wilson's house on Sunday morning, and the New York Times and the Washington Post were all over the floor. They were reading them to pieces. And Mrs. Wilson knew I liked to read, and she'd say, "Do you know there's a new book by this Baldwin? Have you read that?" I'll check it out. But it meant so much to have these cosmopolitan people, these unembarrassed intellectual people, these intellectual travelers living in the neighborhood. And I'll never forget, I'll cry again now, I'll never forget the time I came back from college for the holiday, and Mr. Wilson said, "Hey, come on in," and he had some friends there. He said, "This is my godson, Bobby." And I said, "I don't know if I can." You know, I'm Malik's godfather, and but for him to adopt me in a moment like that, almost, I'd run upstairs and cry. But they accepted me, and when I was in high school, I was lucky enough to have been a merit scholar. You know, you take some test and there you are, you're a so-called merit scholar. And what it meant was that my mailbox was suddenly, I get letters from colleges I'd never heard of.
Please don't dismiss merit scholar. That is not an easy accomplishment.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I can't say much. I don't remember really,
Okay.
except that there often were, as there are now, moments when you get to school and the teacher says, "Boys and girls, we're going to take a test today," and so I've got your special pencils ready, and so everybody to go to the bathroom and if you need to, and in 10 minutes you're going to come back here and I'm going to say, start. And so that's all I knew.
Okay.
It was one of those, and I did the test. And
you became one of the merit
I
scholars.
was a merit scholar.
Yeah.
And by the way, you remind me of something that's related to this. When I was in, I'm going to start this way. I told my mother that for me it was very significant that at Paul Junior High and at Coolidge there was the honors track. It was a way of resegregating the school. There was the honors track, college prep, business, and then there was what was called social adjustment. And the way that went was all white, nearly all white, one or two exceptions, all black with one or two white exceptions, and then absolutely all black, almost all boys, and that was being guarded in the basement of social adjustment. Terrible. But within honors, there was what was called top honors, and then there was kind of secondary honors. And I was in secondary honors, and the teachers were always saying, well, I'm having to take a little longer to teach this because, of course, the top honors people have got it and gone, but let's see if you can get it. So they would tease us this way, and I suffered under that, and I was trying, as I told you, to be the number one of everything. And I remember finally, when I was in the 10th grade, I was promoted to top honors. And it meant the world to me. And I told my mother about that, and this was 25 years later or more. And I said, I must have blown the test that they gave us to place us this way. And she said, oh, Bobby, did I make a mistake? The teacher met with the parents and told us where we were to be placed. And I said, he works so hard as it is, don't put him in first honors, put him in the second and let him relax a little bit. I said, Mama, was that wrong? And I think now that it was good, because I met Steve, who was placed there because of the French. He wasn't quite fluent. And what difference did it really make? Except that it sort of kept me humble. I felt like I had to work harder, that no matter what I was doing, it wasn't enough. And I had to continue trying. So I don't remember how we got to that one, but
Merit scholar.
Oh yeah, and so along the way there was this other thing, merit scholar. So I've got, and I remember thinking, I think I'll go to Wesleyan. I want to go to Ohio Wesleyan University. And the only reason for that was that a woman named Miss Ewing, who I admired, because she taught us Chaucer and Shakespeare and Melville, and she cared about writing, and I was beginning to love literature. And she was an Ohio Wesleyan graduate, and she said, well, Robert, maybe you'll. And so I didn't know, I'd never heard of any of them. Vanderbilt. I mean, I was getting these things, and they meant nothing to me. And then I went to see Mr. Wilson with these letters. And I said, my father wants me to go to Howard, but I need to leave town. And my mother wants me to go to DC Teachers College, and I'm not going to do that. And I don't know what is Oregon. And Mr. Wilson said, let's look at these things. They can't be all the same. Let's see what they are. And he developed a pile that had Brown University, and I forget what others were, but among them Stanford, and some other more elite schools.
Yeah.
And he said, you should keep Howard in the pile, because that's where you go. But, think about these other ones. And so I began to want to go to Brown University. I think this because I said, I'm Brown, they're Brown, let's get together. I didn't know any more about it than that. I never knew a thing. One girl from our school named Judy Fitzhugh had gone to Pembroke, the girls' school of Brown. And so that made it seem within reach. She was black. And then there's another break in the pattern here. When I was at Coolidge, I began to want to be a writer, and signed up and wrote for the school newspaper. I was the sports editor of the school newspaper, the Coolidge Courier. And the woman who ran that who was the faculty sponsor, was a beautiful woman named Helen Levinson. And Miss Levinson struck me as the smartest person on the planet. She taught French and English and Russian and German, I believe. But she also was the faculty sponsor for the yearbook and the school newspaper. And she taught a course on journalism. And so I took the course in journalism, and she only admitted 10 students to that, and we had to write in class every day. And we'd get to class and she'd say, we disliked our principal a lot, Mr. Reynolds. And she came to class and she said, boys and girls, Mr. Reynolds has been viciously shot on the front steps of our school. Here are the facts of the case. The gun was a .45. He's bleeding profusely, and all we know now is that he's been taken away. They don't know who did it, and the story's due in 20 minutes. And we had something like that. We had to write the headline too with a certain number of points. We'd count those Reynolds shot, Reynolds. And we met 3 times a week, and the next class meeting, she would read the papers that she thought were successful and tell us why they were good. And she would also read to us from the New Republic and the Saturday Review, and she would read from the London Times. She'd read from the editorial pages of different newspapers. So she said, you know, there's a much wider world than you. So you took a literature class. Have you read Dostoevsky? Have you read Tolstoy? Have you read Chekhov? You got a long ways to go. So you got to start somewhere, but you got to start. Let's go. And how I love that woman. I tried so hard to write something that she would read. And when it happened, I was the happiest boy in the world. But because she'd gone to some place called Hunter College, which I assumed was, you know, the equivalent of Oxford, or I took her those letters, that last pile that Mr. Wilson had made, and I said, what do you think about all this? And she'd say, and she called us Mr. Amelia wants to go to Brown University. I said, my goodness. Northwestern University. And she said, I think the place for you would be Stanford University, because it's a lower key place, and you'll find yourself there. It's just as tough as these other places, but they'll care about you. And if they're writing you, that's good. And I'd never heard of Stanford, and so I began to look at the brochures there. They had a jazz program. They had a writing program, jazz band, had a baseball team. I didn't tell the baseball story. I'd been baseball crazy all my life, on Little League all the way through. And so that became the focus of my attention. I also thought Brown, and so I applied to 8 schools, and I'd have trouble naming them now, but I know Brown and Howard and Stanford were places I was strongly considering. And when I think about it now, I don't think I could get into Stanford right now. It's such a tough school. But they were trying to integrate. They've been accepting, I think, 2 black, maybe 2 Jews and 2 Asians, and 1 black. And this was there'd been a couple years now when they'd been taking more. And so I went to Stanford, and we called a meeting of the Black Student Union, the Negro Student Union. We were thinking about calling it. And we realized that there were 39 of us, counting the graduate students and undergraduate business school, 39 black students out of 12,000. And so we were, but this was supposed to be the huge gathering. And,
amazing. What was was it like moving to California?
Um, my friends gave me a party the night before I left, and my girlfriend at that time, named Sharon Keller, who went to Antioch College, and gave me a bottle of whiskey. And I'd never really drunk any alcohol to excess. I'd have a beer here and there. I was 17. But I thought it would help me if I drank a good part of that bottle. It might help me sleep because I was so nervous about leaving. But in fact, alcohol, in my case anyway, I didn't sleep at all. Anyway, we were at that party, and another kid named Elliot Silverman, so you can see that things are changing, brought a record by Nina Simone. I'd never heard of her. And I thought, she's the greatest thing in this world. Broadway ballads and blues. And she's talking about the Sea Lion Woman, and these other great songs were on there. We talked more than anything else, about 10 of us, including Chico. And Steve, Steve was back there too. He'd gone away to Zambia, and then he was back to go to Yale. So it's interesting, this before going on, that at this Coolidge High School, considering the trouble they're in now, my best friends Chico went to Harvard, Steve went to Yale, Henry went to Princeton, Percy went to Hamilton and then Harvard, Mike McTighe went to Brown and then Harvard, and we had kids who could have been anywhere. And I'll say one more thing before coming back to this other part of California. In the physics class, we had a teacher who really didn't approve of the change to teach these black. So he wouldn't call on us in class. And but we would raise our hands anyway, he just would call on us. And there was a boy named Percy, his name was Percy Looney, and believe me, he suffered from that. African American. And Percy was a math genius. And so he was always, and finally, I can't remember his name now, he said, what do you want? What is it? What is your hand up? He said, you asked 2 questions back. Nobody had the answer. Here's the answer to that one. And then here's the next one, and here's the next one. And he just said, you keep your seat, son. That's enough of that. So he wouldn't encourage him, but we were getting, at Coolidge High School, we took physics, we took geometry, trigonometry, Latin. And so it had been part of the academic white system. And as I say, Percy went to Hamilton, and then I met him at Harvard Law School, where he'd been a geology major at Hamilton. So now this guy who knows all about rocks is also a lawyer. So he was hired by the oil companies and other energy, for better or worse. That's what he did. But what was it like to go to California? So I spent all night trying to sleep, and in the morning, my mother, father, and sister, and grandmother went with me to the airport. And none of us had ever been to California. None of us had ever been west of Chicago. We'd gone to visit family there, and many had not been west of Northwest Washington. Not very much. None of us had much. And so we went to what was then National Airport. And the thing that will make me cry again, unless I talk about it quickly, is that my grandmother, as I was getting ready to get on the plane, had something balled up in her kind of trembling hand and put it in my hand. And it was a handkerchief that was filled with coins. And ever since I'd known her, I'd known about that she wouldn't, you pick up that penny, boy, you don't need that penny. And she would, and so she had saved, I don't know what it, maybe let's call it $4.50 worth of quarters and half dollars, and maybe a silver dollar, and she wanted me to have that. And she wasn't a poor woman, really, but she wasn't rich either, and so this was significant. And became a kind of good luck talisman for me to have this thing from the Rams. I never saw her again. She died that year while I was in they couldn't afford to fly me back. That was the other thing. My father had said, now look, you're not going to Howard, but you had a full ride. Here you are, you're going out to California. So you're going to, when you get off the bus from the airport, you are going to go directly, you get to Stanford, to the employment office and get yourself some kind of job. And my understanding with him was that he was going to borrow the money that was needed for my tuition and room, but I was responsible for my board, for any food, and anything else I wanted, I had to find for myself. And I am very proud of that he said, you know, I'm trusting you to know what you're doing now. When I hit California. And so all of that was, and I was so, and I remember the bus driving, have you been to Stanford? You see the long line of eucalyptus trees, and I thought, this is a magnificent, where am I going? And then above the road, Leland Stanford Junior University. Junior University. It's been some mistake, maybe Miss Levinson. And then eventually I realized that it was named after Leland's son.
So 39 of you, blacks.
There were 39 of us, and we became very, very close. I saw one of them at Ernie Wilson's party a month ago. Paul Carrion. He changed his name from Paul Williams to Paul Carrion because he said he was going to carry on all his life. He's an MD and a wonderful professional and a great man. He was part of that. He was a graduate student in the medical school. He was a medical school student at that time. And
were you treated okay? Were there issues?
There were, I mean...
What were the issues? If you don't mind talking about it.
Well, let me start this way by saying about 10 years ago there was a reunion of Stanford graduates, and the black graduates from all different classes, or many different classes, got together. And we'd been on panels through the day talking about different things. But when we sat at the bar together, you know, without being on stage, he said, man, how was it for you? He said, it was a bitch, man. I wouldn't do that again for all the money in this world. And so that was part of the untold, the story we hardly even told to each other at the time. And we were regularly trotted out to talk about how great it was to be at Stanford and how California was such a golden place. And certainly it was. But here again, I was in a situation of the only black person in my classes very often. And I'd be brought to go to these so-called mixers, and you were expected to dance with the black girls, not only by everybody else, but by the black girls themselves. They're like, are you gonna, I thought you were here as part of the thing. And so there you were, and you're looking at these white girls, and you just don't have any idea if they will refuse you or not, or then if you somehow ended up on the dance floor where there were lots of people dancing and you ended up with one of them, then what often happened was that the sisters would then say, I know you're not up here dancing with Miss Ann. And so you were like, oh wait. And so there was all of that complicated tension and uncertainty. But it was also the year when at San Francisco State, black student unions formed there. And so there was great pressure on groups like ours at Stanford and all these little schools, and not only there in California, for the black students to amalgamate and to be part of the freedom movement in some kind of way. Jones, who became Amiri Baraka, and many others, Nikki Giovanni and Stokely Carmichael, and these others were in the news, and we knew about them, and what are we doing at this white school when our brothers and sisters were representing? How could we be part of all of that? There was one, my freshman year, we were debating whether to be the Black Student Union and affiliate with the revolutionaries up at San Francisco State, as we do, or the Negro Student Union and be what our mamas and daddies wanted us to be. And I remember one kid saying he did not want to belong to any organization that his white roommate, who was his best friend on the campus, could not join to. And he'd come a long way from South Carolina to avoid all of this. And if we were going to recreate a segregated scene, he was out. He didn't mind belonging to a Negro Student Union, but he was bringing his roommate to the next meeting. And so we were sitting there feeling nervous, and I hadn't thought about much of that myself, Negro. And Leroy Jones came to one of our meetings, and he was listening to this conversation, and he said, "You children are the most useless windbags I have ever heard in my lifetime. What you need to do is to form a circle and just shoot one another. You are not part of the thing. You're useless. Just do yourselves a favor and get out of this life. You're not part of it." And as a piece of rhetoric, it was very powerful. And we voted soon after that to become the Black Student Union, and you could not bring your white. You were not part of us if you didn't recognize that we were a black group that had our own direction and concerns. And meanwhile, my roommate was my best friend too, a white kid. At Stanford, the routine was that this new integration thing would mean that one black kid was in room 330, one was in room 215, and one was in 101. They spread you out, and if you were a humanities major, you had a science roommate. That's for everybody now. If you were a sports kid, you had a kid who had never played sports in life. And so there I was. My roommate was a science. He was a biology. He was interested in oceanography or ocean science, marine biology. And he was from a relatively wealthy family, Woodside, California. And he told me that he had never seen a black person except when they were in a car going through San Francisco. So he said, "Excuse me, I just don't know, I haven't had this experience." And so there we were, Christopher Hansen and I. But I remember very well that when I was making my way up the stairs for the first time to Rinconada, he'd gotten there early. Rinconada was the name of the house in Wilbur Hall, the boys' dorm at Stanford. And I heard this wailing of a harmonica. And I said, "Well, whoever that is has got it going on." And I opened the door, and there was Chris playing this harmonica. And he loved somebody called Sonny Boy Williamson, who was a black Mississippi blues singer and harmonica player of the first degree. And at that time, one thing I haven't talked about at all is that I was a saxophone player, and I had my saxophone case. And so I remember early on, we said, "Well, we may not have anything else in common, but if you play the blues in F, I think we might have something to say to one another." And we played all the time. And we would sometimes just go down to the common room and play together, or just play up in the dorm. And we would go to dances sometimes and play during intermission. There was a little juice bar set up at the student union that year. And you could sign up to entertain, and so, not he and I, but another kid and I would go there and play Take Five. We'd be, ba-ba-doo-ba-da-ba-da-ba-doo. I could play that, I think. And so, what was it like to be in California? I had friends, and some of them, as I say, became lifelong friends within that Black Student Union. And they weren't sort of the Black Student Union, they were my dear, dear blood brothers and sisters. And Chris and I became friends until the end of his life. And he was, this I'm not supposed to tell, but one of the kids whose name I can't give, was one of the radicals from California, from Watts. And he said, you living with that rich white boy. I'm sure he has one of those new electric typewriters. You need to raise that up and bring it to me, man. We got work to do, for the revolution. And I said, I know I look like a square to you, and I don't have the right haircut or anything else. But if you think I'm your flunky who's going to go to my friend's desk and steal something for you, you're out of your mind. And if you think I won't fight you, you try me. I try to be calm, but you're not going to make me do this either. So there were these subterranean tensions, and that guy, by the way, and I became very good friends. And he was a super right. He's the one who said, "You're. I thought you were going to be a poet. Here you're going to graduate school." And so I guess it was like other communities. It was very, very complicated. After freshman year.
Excuse me, sorry. Just to warn you, we have 1 more minute left on the cameras.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Maybe you should ask this. All right.
No. Finish this. Are we gonna get more cards soon?
I'm not sure. We can. Yeah.
Are we gonna get more cards soon?
Yeah, that's we have to dump
Because we'll
cards.
take a break, but I'm not done with him.
Okay. Yeah, so we can take a break, and
Okay.
then we'll dump the cards.
Okay.
Get them
Oh,
going.
good. So, let's just,
I forget where I was.
should we just stop right now?
I can tell a 1 minute story.
Okay. All right.
Shall we? Are we ready?
Sure.
You're still rolling.
Yeah.
At Stanford, after freshman year, you moved into one of the frat houses, if you will, or you moved off campus if you had the money to do that. Now the frats were all segregated or newly integrated by law, and they didn't want you in there. I went around to the rush sessions, and it was very clear that they were either going to bend over backwards and be your best friend in a way that was horrifying, or they were going to exclude you. And so I wasn't sure what to do because I couldn't afford to live off campus. But there was one frat that had broken with the National, Beta Chi, and their admission policy was that they could admit the first 25 people who signed the list. Women, men, student or non-student. And so all of the writers and actors and activists and the president of the student body lived there. And so that is where I met people black and white and Asian and just different faiths. That became another haven. And my roommate was a white kid named Fast Eddie, Edward Baker, and another one named John Haygood. Both of them super brilliant, wonderful. During my junior year, 2 of my partners from Beta Chi decided to get a house together in East Palo Alto, which is an unincorporated area adjacent to Palo Alto, the black community historically there. So the 3 of us moved into this house, and now you've got this deep southern, semi-rural white kid, and whom we call Fast Eddie, Eddie Baker. And fast because he talked so slow, you thought he might grind to a complete halt or reverse, but he was the quickest mind I think I've ever met. He was a brilliant boy. And the other one
was John Haygood, who was the roving linebacker for the Stanford team when they didn't make it to the Rose Bowl, but they could have gone. And so he was a remarkable athlete, the fastest man on the field, and as roving linebacker, he had to be big too, because he had to drag people, outrun you and then drag you to the ground. And we were like the unlikely trio, if ever there was one. Here's Eddie talking slow and thinking fast. And he was a political philosophy major. And I learned at his funeral that he was dyslexic, and that's why he didn't go for a PhD, because he couldn't learn another language. It was one of his forms of the dyslexia. The letters would start to swim, or the words, and so he couldn't do that. So he decided that he could go to law school, though, because he didn't have to have a language for that. And that would be how he would pursue his career as a scholar, as a law professor, scholar. And so he became a First Amendment guy. But I mention all that because right from the beginning, he was talking about Nietzsche, whose name he could hardly pronounce. I forget what he called him. And he called the bourgeois the burgies. I mean, he was a country boy, but he was tremendously, just a beautiful guy. And John was African American from Charlotte, North Carolina. And as I say, the biggest man in the field and the fastest. And he was also unlikely character. He was a physics major and a runaway kind of gifted guy in the science and math. But you'd mistake, you saw a big, dark, black guy, you thought football, but he had all these other capacities, of course. And one day, when he was doing his routine as a football player, he had gone out for a run through the neighborhood, and it was adjacent to Palo Alto and Morningside, Mountain View and other mostly white communities. And he was arrested, and he didn't have ID on him, and he said, for the police, the thought that he was a Stanford student was just preposterous. And he couldn't, he said, please call my coach, and they just thought it was a joke. Call anybody at Stanford. And finally, I don't remember what the breakthrough was, but after spending all day locked up, the dean or somebody came and rescued him. And it just made an impression on me that it still makes me jittery now. That no matter how gifted he was in sports and in academia and otherwise, he decided once he wanted to go to law school that he didn't want to sit in class with all white guys again. He changed his major to either art history to psychology, because it was 3/4 women in there, and he was going to law school anyway, so he was a very successful playboy on top of everything else. But it doesn't matter what he was. For those cops, he was. And so that was something that we were all up against. And Eddie had come from a family where everybody in the community in Hopkins, Kentucky, the people that he knew, went to the Selma when the moment came. And his parents didn't want him to go because he was diabetic. And he said, well, it doesn't make any difference. Other people are diabetic. I'm going to go. And he was only, 14 or something. And he said that when his parents said, now listen, we're going to be marching there and we're going to try to make these changes, and you're going to be needing a candy bar, or you're going to be needing the insulin, and you're going to hold everybody up while we're trying to. And so he stayed. That was the thing that got him. He was just a deeply soulful guy. The only white guy I ever knew that would sit and eat chitlins like they were going out of style. We would get pig feet and whatnot, all of us together. So we were very, very good friends, and we suffered some of these things together, but we were like blood brothers and inseparable. They both went to law school, Yale and Berkeley, and they became lawyers. And Eddie had been told as a very small boy that he had one more year to live, and maybe 2 and 3, and somehow he was, and so he lived his life with very deep attention to his diet and to doing what he thought, because he wasn't sure when his last day was coming. And so when they told me that he died, he was going down court to take a shot, that he was a constitutional law professor at NYU, and also teaching at Penn. But he was able to get his writing done despite the dyslexia, and just lived until he was gone. But he was, I feel more grateful than I can express to have had such friends. And you asked about applying to Harvard.
So you finished degree at Stanford?
I did.
What was the decision after that?
Well, this is, you talk about writing a memoir, you have to think about things you hadn't either told anybody or thought about hard yourself very much. Honestly, this was a time when these white schools were looking for black students. And so the fact that I was an honors English major at Stanford made me a very good candidate for the places I applied to: Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, Stanford, and maybe there was another one. And there was the reason I blush a little and hesitate is that there's a lady in the story. It was time for me to go from Stanford and from her. And so I decided, even though I really wanted to stay at Stanford, there were professors and grad students there that I was very close to. I said, let me get out of here and go back east and leave a little lady behind. And so I decided on Harvard. Nowadays, when people go to graduate school, they try to think who the professors are and who have the best programs and everything. I didn't. I just knew Harvard was Harvard. And my friend Henry Kennedy was going to go there. Chico had been there. Although Chico called me right away and said, Harvard has ruined more good Negroes than bad whiskey. That was the old joke about that. He said, don't do it, brother. But I knew he was kidding, and that he had come through there to become more of what I admired in him, even in high school and before. So there I went. There was virtually no black literature program, although that was the thing I was beginning to be interested in. You were required to have 2 classical languages and 2 modern languages. If I'd paid attention to that, I might not have gone at all. And it would have been much wiser for me to go to Yale, where they did have Charles Davis was just getting hired, and they had the great people that we know of from that place. But be that as it may, I went to Harvard.
How was that?
It was. I must say that it was right at the beginning, and in a way all the way through, just inspiring to be there and to think, I want to live up to, this is supposed to be the best school in the country and maybe the best in the world. I want to deserve to be here, and I want to make sure that the best that I have to offer is good enough for Harvard. And so there was an undergraduate at Harvard that I remember very well. And you have to, we can't use this, I'm sure, because of the language of this one, excuse me. But I remember there was a great scholar named Arnold Rampersad. He was just my classmate, or a year or two ahead of me at Harvard. And I remember the undergraduate came up to Arnold and me while we were there, and he was a freshman, and he was saying, I just got here from somewhere, Cleveland, and are you guys up for class, black guys? Maybe you can tell me something. And Arnold was a very formal Trinidadian, very British kind of guy, and he said, well, there's nothing much to say. Just do your best. And the guy said, well, for starters, maybe you can tell me where the library's at. And Arnold said, well, the first thing you need to know is that as a Harvard man, we do not use prepositions at the ends of our sentences. And so you can keep that in mind. And then the undergraduate said, I should have known that. I'm sorry, excuse me, man. Let me ask it again this way. He said, where's the library at, asshole? And so that became a kind of way of thinking about Harvard, that there were all of these pretensions and efforts to measure up and whatnot. But on the serious side, there was a very good course in medieval literature, which I loved. There was a transformative course in 18th century literature, which I'll never forget. Somebody named Walter Jackson Bate was the professor in that class. And he was a wonderful, inspiring exemplar of the Harvard standards, and his books were incredible. And when I first got there was no black literature course, but black studies, thanks to Ernie Wilson and people in the undergraduate fighting mode that he had been part of. There was a black studies program that was building, and there was a young professor named Genevieve, and her name was Geneva Smitherman, and Geneva gave a course. She was a linguist, and she gave a course called Black Language and Literature, and she hired me as a TA just out of the blue because I was a graduate student.
What was the course? What Black Language and Literature? What did it cover? What was
it was a study of the kind of canonical black literature from Frederick Douglass to whoever, James Baldwin. But along with that, she really made clear to all of us things that I hadn't known, really, I hadn't thought about, was that what one might think of as broken English or non-standard or something that needed to be corrected necessarily was a valid system of speech. And she taught us about rural Mississippi black speech as a beautiful creation. And we read things by Alice Walker, who was just beginning to write poetry, published at that time, from Mississippi. From Mississippi, I think so. And so that was what it was. It was really designed to make us think again about the speech that we had all been taught. To even at Howard, a lot of the efforts in writing classes was to get you out of that Southern black speech pattern onto kind of Midwestern standard way of speaking. And so to me, Geneva was a great teacher. And there I was as her TA. And so that was a very, very good experience. I taught a writing course out of the blue that was a kind of a miracle. I hadn't published anything except my own poetry in literary magazines, campus things at Stanford and now at Harvard. but it was a great experience for me to have to design a writing course. And I was teaching with gifted students, not just the freshman writing thing, but these kids who wanted to be novelists. And so that part was really good. There were 4 black students in my class at Harvard. First graduate school of literature in English. 2 from Spelman. I was from Stanford, and there was one guy that was admitted from the federal prison. This was the 60s and 70s. He had written a novel, which he'd sent to Norman Mailer, and Mailer had written to the chair of English and said, "You give this young man anything he wants, he's a genius." And he certainly was. So there he was. He didn't last long because he was more an artist than a scholar. And so for our Milton course, he wrote a long letter to the professor explaining what he was doing when he was supposed to have been reading Milton, but which he had no intention to read at the moment because he was busy doing his. And that Harvard will let you get away with that only so long. So after a year, he was gone. And
So there were 3 of you left.
then there were 3. And the ladies from Spelman got their master's degrees and decided not to go on. So, and then there was one. And so I was, but by my 3rd year, I had passed the language courses, Lord knows how. I dug up my Latin from school, from Coolidge and Paul. I took a Greek course, a 1-year crash course, a summer that met twice a day.
Oh, those are terrible. They're grueling.
And I had enough French to pass that one. And they let me take a course in Igbo. There was a course offered by this wonderful Igbo Nigerian linguist and poet. And so at that time, I was pretty strong in that. And I remember the department said, "What the world is whatever? Okay, we're gonna languages." And so I was off to the races, and I had to decide though if I was really drawn to 18th century or if I was going to follow up the medieval. I love Chaucer, and I love Samuel Johnson, and all of those Richardson and Fielding and the 18th century novelists. I knew nothing about Gustavus Vassa, the black 18th century writer at that time. But anyway, I had to decide, or was I going to stay on this path from the slave narratives to the present? And I decided that on the latter. And I remember going in, during my orals exam, at the end of the exam, the professor said, "Well, now what are you going to do your dissertation on?" And I said, "I'm going to do it in black literature." And they said, and I said, "Well, to me, Ralph Ellison is the chairman of the board, and so I guess it'll be about him." And so they said, "I guess that's it." And when I got outside, I said, "I wonder if that's true, if I'm really going to do that." And it turned out to be the case that I began to follow through on that.
And that's where you eventually got to meet him. Or is that how it happened?
It is. Yeah. It certainly is. My advisor was somebody named Daniel Aaron, whom I mentioned earlier. And Aaron was a great advisor because he was one of these people who, as far as I know, never slept at all. I don't know when he slept. So he said, "You can meet me any morning before 8. And the earlier the better, because there were always students waiting for him by 7:30 or, and so I would get there at 5:30, 6. And very often there'd be only one or nobody there. And then he had known Ellison, and so he understood what I was talking about. And I remember he said to me, so you want to do a book on Ellison? I said, well, I want to do a dissertation on Ellison. He said, well, no, first you have to get your vocabulary straight. I'm not interested in your dissertation, not really. Let's do a book on Ellison, and if you can agree that that's what we're working on, then I'll help you. And I said, well, I don't know if I can. I have 2 or 3 years. I don't know if I can do it. He said, Mr. O'Mealy, if you do a page a day, as I do, you'll have a book a year. So certainly in 2 years, and you're going to do a page a day if you're working with me. And so he was a dream of a advisor. But I'll tell you also that I quickly learned that there was a limit to how much he knew about black literature, that I knew more about Gwendolyn Brooks and Robert Hayden and many others, and certainly about the Black Arts Movement. He knew certain ones, but he was more interested in the kind of canonical, Emily Dickinson and so on, Henry James. And so I was telling my mother this on the telephone, and she said, well, why don't you call Sterling Brown? And I said, well, why don't I call the Wizard of Oz? And Mama, I can't just call Sterling Brown. And she said, well, just a minute here. And she said, Lincoln 658. She looked it up in the phone book, and there he was, Sterling Brown. Is it Sterling A. Brown? I said, well, yes, Sterling Allen. And so she gave me the number, and I called it out, just cold, out of the blue. And he said, that's just like Harvard to call me. Just call me right home and call me at home. He said, well, let's fix a date and come on down. Give me time to reread Invisible Man. So I began circling down to Howard. He wasn't retired then. But he met me as if I were at Howard, or as if I were part of his responsibility. And he pushed me more than Aaron knew how to push me. He said, well, what do you know about the New Deal? Well, what about the WP? Well, what about Ellison's on the project? Well, who else is on the project? Everybody black is on the project. That's Robert Hayden, there's Gwendolyn Brooks. And so I taped those conversations. I went, because he was so brilliant that I couldn't comprehend what he was telling me at times. He talked about Elaine Locke as if he were part of the family, and he'd known Locke very well. And he had stories about Du Bois, and for him, Zora Neale Hurston was Zora Neale. He said Zora Neale was there, Zora was the party, Zora Neale. So he had that kind of informal, splendid firsthand experience. And then he would say, yes, right, but we need to read Barthes, and there are new things by Foucault, and you need to bring it all. And so that was fantastic, and I began to love Harvard then because I didn't have any courses to take. I could sit in on something if I felt like it. I moved out of Cambridge because I said, why am I studying ancient Greek? I moved to Roxbury, black community, and I got a job teaching there. I taught, there was a program for medical workers at the lowest level, these women who changed bedpans and changed the sheets and rolled people over. And they were trying to get their GED so they could get a college degree so they could move on. And so I had a job. My job was to teach them what they needed to know to pass the English course for the GED. So that's why I know the 8 parts of speech, and that's why I know the adverb questions and things they need. But also that's how I kept myself sane, I felt. Now I'm doing something that I know is part of the community uplift effort. I joined the church there, and I went down to see Sterling. And I did call him Sterling, by the way, as he insisted. I called him Prof because I had a hard time calling the great man by his first name, but he would scold me when I didn't. And so Harvard became a kind of launch pad for me. I met my wife, who was at MIT, and who was slowly deciding that she wanted to become a dancer rather than a city planner, and so that was part of the excitement. I enrolled in the Elma Lewis Community School of the Arts, where Malik's uncle Billy taught dance. And my wife took his classes. And that was the other thing. I took my old saxophone out, and there were so few men taking advantage of the community art school that they changed the rules, and any male of the species could come in and take whatever classes they wanted for free.
Wow.
And so I joined the band, and the leaders of every class, the teachers there were absolutely first string. Like Billy Wilson was a premier modern dancer. His wife, who taught Jackie ballet, was a Danish prima ballerina. And the leader of the band was somebody named Jackie Byard, who was this great on-the-scene, first call saxophonist and pianist. He would sometimes lead the band, blowing the saxophone in one hand, playing the piano with the other, and directing just with the movements of his body. And I remember again and again, he'd say, "Okay, we're going to do the Amelia, you're going to lay out, baby." Because I was strictly amateur, and I couldn't play in tune, and I still had the old horn that my grandmother had bought me, that I later learned was impossible to play in tune. But anyway, with all of that going on, I would meet Dan Aaron at 5:30 in the morning. I'd go see Sterling at least once a month. I had a fellowship in those days that meant that I could just write. Eventually, I moved back to Harvard. Once Jackie and I got married, we moved into the student dorm on Mount Auburn, which is beautiful, overlooking the river. And I was able to do my work on Ellison. I kept writing to him and asking him to help me. And then finally, he came to Harvard to give a talk. He and Murray, I met them both the same day. There was Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison were part of a panel on Elaine Locke, the philosopher and inventor, one might say, of the New Negro movement, a great Howard professor. And there was a panel of wonderful people, Nathan Huggins and some others, Harold Cruz, Holly West. I'm sure there are others, along with Ralph Ellison and Murray. And I was there with my tape recorder. So Ellison wouldn't answer my letters, and so I was going to at least get what he said in public down. And I thought, well, I've got him here. And when there was a break in the conference, I went over to him. He's smoking a cigar, as you could do indoors in that time. And I said, I've been writing to you, but never mind that. One of my thesis questions is that you came along in response to the Harlem Renaissance, which you felt had failed because Black people had not succeeded in building the institutions that we needed to sustain the victories of a Langston Hughes and even of a Duke Ellington. We didn't have the institutions. I remember Ellison looked at me, and I had my dashiki on of those days and what I could do combing up my balding head with an afro. And he looked at me. He was very much the man in the Brooks Brothers suit, clean as a hound dog, as they used to say. And he just said, well, my answer to that would be no. And it was, I remember thinking, he's saying no to my question, but also no to the hair, no to the dashiki, no to the everything. No. And I said, well, the answer is no. And he said, you said we didn't have institutions. We did have institutions. We had the Constitution of the United States. We have the Bill of Rights. These are our institutions. He said, and Mr. McNeely, he had a hard time getting my name right. We had jazz. And then there was Mr. Ellison, we're ready. And so he was gone and left me there with the cigar smoke. And I was thinking, and I'm part of the Black Arts movement. And, you know, we're the Sonia Sanchez and Donnell Lee and Amiri Baraka. And he's talking about the Constitution of the United States. And when I said institution, I meant we didn't have publishing houses and black theater companies and things like that. And he wasn't talking about that at all. So we had the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And then he said we had jazz. So it was one of the most bewildering moments of my career as a thinker, or as a would-be thinker at that time. And I wasn't so interested in Albert Murray. I hadn't really heard of him. But I was fascinated by this, the lucidity of his thought. And I said, he doesn't have any notes. Where is it? He's pouring out of him. And so I at least said hello to him and told him I wanted to write about Ellison. He said, well, call me. And I said, well, and he wrote his number down. And so he was very unlike Ellison. Ellison was always like a fortress. You couldn't get through to him. But Murray, so I read Hero in the Blues, his first book. He was working on the Americans. And eventually, I think I read On the Americans before I went to see him. And that began another very, very important series of conversations. A part of my story, and that's more than you want to know, is that because my father died when I was 19, and he died out of the blue. He was fine as far as I knew. And we were on vacation. He finally got a chance to go back to Jamaica and see his relatives and introduce me to this. And gradually my father's accent, which he'd worked very hard to get rid of, he's talking about, oh, won't you come in here, man, and hear the thing, we don't eat the rice. I said, who is this talking? And he was so happy. He was drinking rum and partying and catching up with old friends, and he died of a heart attack there. And it was such a terrible shock to lose somebody that I had modeled myself after and that I revered, that I don't think I'll ever recover from it, not really. But one symptom of all that was that as I look back on that, older black men became very important to me. And whether they wanted me or not, I adopted Sterling, who did want me, and I adopted Albert Murray. And I have dreams about Ralph Ellison when he's my father and he's telling me what to do, and I'm going to do it. Though I learned to resist him too. But that's certainly part of my story. And Murray was very, very generous, and took me in and took me with him. And he was another one like Sterling. He talked about jazz as if everybody knew the complete works of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Bud Powell and all of them. And so every time I left this company, I would go to the library or the record store or the bookstore and try to catch up with him. I taped those conversations too. I never heard of Andre Malraux. At Harvard, I never read Malraux. I'd never read Kenneth Burke. He kept talking about Walter Benjamin. I hadn't read him. And so that became as important a course as anything I'd ever had at Harvard. Just talking with him and then trying to catch up with him. I was still talking to Sterling and trying to catch up with him. Or I would, no, not yet. Was I? Not yet, because I wasn't doing my dissertation quite yet. And so what was exciting about Murray for me was that he had so much under his fingertips as a literary man. And for him, everything was so pertinent to his own project as an artist. And so it wasn't Hemingway you need to know as an educated person. He said, you need to read that because you need to do what he's telling you. He's got pieces about how to be a writer and what to read. What are you doing? Why haven't you? And so that whole way of looking at art and looking at everything else in search of things you can need as you build your own sense of self was
so valuable. I mean, for you to have had access to this man is incredible.
He was soon writing, and then we're done altogether?
5 minutes.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so are we okay with this now, or is there anything else? Because I have one last question.
Okay.
Which is, you've taken us on a journey from DC and that amazing community that stretched across the country, segregated but stretched across the country. I would want to know, what would you like to say to the younger generation of Black folks today, having had your experience?
Well, you know, I have 2 sons, Gabriel and Douglas. Gabriel Prosser, he's Gabriel the Mighty Angel, and Frederick Douglass. That's who they're named after, of course. And one is 34 and the other is 36, 37. And what I tell them is, first of all, I don't expect them necessarily to go to Harvard or MIT like their mother, or to become a dancer, or to do anything in particular. I just want them to be happy. I want them to find partners that they love and that really love them, and I want them to know what love is so they can recognize it and nurture it. I want them to do work that's fulfilling to them, whatever it is. My grandmother used to say, just be the best of whatever you are. You can sweep those streets, you sweep them. I want them to do that. But I do feel this other thing, that I want them to feel the handoff from all the people that I've named and many that I haven't, so that as young people, they can do their version of standing up to adopt somebody at the church when the moment comes. And they can do their version of writing down their name and saying, call me anytime, as Albert Murray did to me, and so that they can be part of that sense of responsibility that is a continuum. And that's a lot to ask, but that is what I think I'm responsible for asking. I want them to be happy. I want them to feel fulfilling work and love. Those are the things without which life can seem meaningless. But so can it seem meaningless, as far as I can see, if you don't have this other part. So that's what I would say to young people.
Okay.
That would be my
So
advice.
would you say, in some ways, I mean, I don't know how to ask this question, but was life better in that community?
I don't know how to answer that question. It's not that it isn't fair, but I don't know how to answer it. I once asked Ellison what it meant that I said, you went to a segregated school, Tuskegee. Do we need these things? Do we need black schools? Do we need black churches? And he said, Mr. McNeely, because I was writing about him, I made him very uneasy. said, we have to look at all these things in a historical continuum. We certainly needed them when we first invented them, and we have needed them too, and we have them now, and they're fulfilling purposes that no one else is fulfilling in quite the same ways. And so I guess my answer would be, I feel fortunate beyond measure to have lived on G Street and Taylor Street and then Quackenboss Street. James Baldwin says in one interview, he said, but I would never consider doing it again. I wouldn't want those without the Brightwood and the Paul and the Coolidge and the Stanford and all the rest of it.